encircling gloom.
Hey there, listeners. Look, I got to tell you, this has been a really weird, intense past 4 or 5 days, however long it's been since we sat with John Dehlin and did this live broadcast last Friday. So here's what this episode's going to be. I know there's been like things that were put up, taken down, put up, taken down. The reason for Infants on Thrones taking things down recently was because the file, it was like a 4-hour plus huge file, and when John Dehlin took his down, all the traffic started coming over to us, and it just shut us down. So I've done a couple of things. Before that happened, I started going through and making some changes to what had previously been published. I got about halfway through that when I said, this is taking too long, and I just stopped. You'll hear that in this version. I'm going to break this into 3 pieces. So it's mainly the panel discussion from last Friday, where we're talking about this secret recording that happened between a general authority, a church historian, and Trevor, who you may or may not have heard his interview on Mormon Stories. But you'll hear a little bit from him in here. So it's the first 2 parts are going to be mainly the panel discussion, where I have inserted portions of the recorded interview into that, kind of infant style. I don't know. You come to expect that. And then the third part will just be that recording itself, the conversation between Trevor and the church historian and the general authority. So that's what you're in for today. Neat, huh? Hopefully it'll stay up. We'll see.
The factual record as it relates to the church's origins. Everyone should be able to make a conscious decision with all the information on the table.
This is Infants on
Mormon Stories Podcast.
The philosophies of men mingled with
confusion?
You want me to say that?
Yeah.
we are the core.
Welcome back to Infants on Thrones. I'm Glenn Ostland, and here's what you are in for today. Now, several weeks ago, a guy named Trevor had a meeting with his former mission president, who's now a general authority. With him was also a member of the church history department who's worked on the LDS.org essays and the Joseph Smith papers and other projects. A guy named, well, we don't really need his name, do we? Now, Trevor asked them a bunch of questions, kind of CES letter style, and then he secretly recorded their responses. And he handed that recording over to John Dehlin to be published through Mormon Stories. So, John reached out last week to several of us infants to join him for a panel discussion about this recording, but we didn't really know what the recording was. We just got on like, okay, all right, we'll do this. So this past Friday, John Hamer and I joined John Dehlin and Lindsay Hansen Park for a live Facebook video cast thingy. Maybe some of you saw it, to listen to this audio for the first time, to meet Trevor for the first time, and then to kind of smack down what we were hearing after we had just heard it. So that's what you're going to be hearing today. And we're doing a coordinated release thing between Mormon Stories and Infants on... Or we were, until after having published this for a day, John Dehlin got a lot of negative feedback for the ethics of publishing a secretly recorded audio recording without the consent of everyone that was involved in it. Yeah, it's legal, but is it ethical? And that's a point that we made in the panel discussion, but John ultimately decided to pull it down. Well, we're not pulling down the episode from Infants on Thrones, but what I am going to do, I will take the time that it takes, and this is going to take a lot of time, to go through and edit once again to redact out the names of the participants who did not give their consent. Now, I recognize that doesn't make it completely whole and ethical, but I think that this tells an interesting story, and it's one that I will talk about throughout the course of this new redacted version, updated version of, I called it Why Can't We Be Friends? I mean, there's a reason I called it Why Can't We Be Friends? And part of it is if you're doing secret recordings and not, giving respect to the other side, well, then you really can't be friends. So do we want to be friends? Anyway, I will talk more about this throughout the course of this, but, that's what this is. I'll also include the full recording of the conversation between the general authority and the church historian and Trevor. I'll include that here at the end as an extended Easter egg of sorts. It's like an hour and 20 minutes long, so it's a long Easter egg. So if you want to hear these things basically raw and unedited in the order that this all happened last Friday, then jump over to Mormon Stories. You'll be able to hear that there, unless it gets taken down. But if you want to hear maybe a little more polished, edited version of what we did on Friday, then just keep listening because you're in the right place. And please remember that polishing these episodes like we do on Infants on Thrones takes 2 or 3 tons of work. So, you could send us a PayPal donation if you really want to on our website. Also, validation, it's a nice idea, but it's basically impossible. And facts don't matter. I'm kidding, sort of. Hold that thought. I'll probably editor's privilege why I said this later, but for now, let's hand it over to John and Trevor and get started.
All right. So talk really quickly about why people are asking, did you get their permission to record the audio? And
Right.
And there's people that are going to say it's unethical to
Right.
record something in secret and to release it without their permission.
Right.
We touched on this, but just repeat. How do you respond to those concerns?
This is a big.
And
this is-
what's in your heart? What are you trying to do here? Is this a gotcha?
No, this is absolutely not. And so that's why I mean, obviously, I want to give this up to people that would love to be in the same situation that I was in. Maybe ask the same or similar questions that I had. And really just kind of take off the gloves for a minute and really talk real. Because like we said, this is not a small thing. This is not a small, community organization here. We're talking about millions of people that literally believe this stuff or just don't even know that these problems even exist. And so, I just think that, as much as different people have sacrificed, opened themselves up and done different things that have helped me, kind of get through this hard time. I want to be able to contribute to that. And I was very upfront, was saying that, yeah, there's a very high likelihood that they don't even know that this recording exists. I had a feeling that may have known because I set my phone up on the table and he kind of distanced himself a little bit. That might have been why he wasn't talking very much. I don't know. But again, I'm fully aware of that, but I hope that they can see that this is the sincerity of my heart, wanting to share truth and information and everything that they said, I think they would stand by today. So it's not like a gotcha situation at all. It's in an open format, sharing ideas.
So let me comment on this because I really wanted to comment on this in real time, but the format did not allow me to make that comment. I follow up with some similar comments, but I think that Trevor's intentions are a little clouded, and you can't say that this isn't a gotcha in any way, and you can't say that it's an open dialogue when people don't know that they're being recorded, and that So if Trevor knows that this is being recorded and anticipates that he's going to be giving it to John Dehlin, because John Dehlin asks people to record your encounters with general authorities. If they're coming and giving a talk, record it, and we'll do something cool with it on Mormon Stories. So I think that Trevor probably knew that. He had this audience in mind as he was doing this, but the other 2 guys didn't, and that's not fair, and that's not open. And I don't think that they would appreciate, even if the things that they say they wouldn't back away from. There's a squeamishness for believers to talk with non-believers to try and justify their beliefs because they kind of know it's a no-win game. They can't convince us to believe when we don't believe. And so I think there's generally a hesitation to engage in any kind of conversations. And when you go in like this with a secret recording, I'm afraid it pushes people away and makes it less likely to have an open conversation on the other side of these issues than it would otherwise. And I think Trevor understands that at this point as well. And, like I've had this idea for a while. It's a big project. And I mean, like, if you're listening to Infants on Thrones for a long time, you know that there's big ideas that we talk about, and sometimes we deliver on them, sometimes we don't. I'm still working on that Shown project that I've been working on since Christmas. And by working on it, I mean I'm putting it off as much as possible because it's just so overwhelming to me. But I had this idea of doing a smackdown of the CES letter and trying to get somebody that is a believer to be a part of that panel and to have a more diverse group that's looking at it and really saying, here are the contents of the CES letter. Here's its strengths, here's its weaknesses, here's why some people accept it, here's why some people don't. In order to do that, you've got to have trust with people on the other side, that you can have a civil conversation about it, and it doesn't just turn into bashing where we go, oh no, you're wrong for this reason. They go, oh, well, you're wrong for this reason. That's not helpful. We can already say, these are the things that we disagree on. Let's put that aside and talk about other things. I'd like to try that. But when there's things like this, I think, and first of all, that's hard to do anyway, right? I mean, how many of those do we actually have in the Mormon podcasting world? But when these things happen, I think it makes people less, because we're betraying trust that's already really flimsy in the first place. And it was actually a very nice and generous thing for this general authority and church historian to take the time to meet with Trevor and to talk with him about his concerns. Where I think that there's a real value in this is that there are so many people who struggle going through a faith crisis. A faith crisis is it's the hardest. It's one of the hardest things. It's hard. I mean, as far as like first world problems, hard. It's a hard thing to go through, and to have the opportunity to sit down with a general authority, with a church historian, and ask them questions and hear their answers, I think is something that a lot of people would like to have had and to have experienced. And so for Trevor to have that experience and share that on a podcast like this, it gives that experience vicariously, by proxy. We desire all to receive it. We were raised where doing proxy work is an acceptable thing, right? So, I think Trevor's still working through a lot of this himself. I think that he has a lot of pain, feels betrayed that the church leaders say, if you've got questions, come to your church leaders, we've got answers. And then he goes and asks them, and, to his ears, they don't have answers. I would push back on that and say, actually, Trevor, they do have answers, and you've got to listen to what they're saying and really try to understand what they're saying. And I don't feel like he did that. I feel like he did a little bit, but moved from topic to topic to topic that's like damning topic, damning topic, damning topic. So it never really was that open dialogue and conversation. But to frame this as saying that the leaders aren't aware of the issues and they don't have answers, I don't think that's true. I think they are aware. They're definitely not aware in as much detail as people who have really struggled with this, and this has been the catalyst for a faith transition. Why would they be that aware? They're not that aware of it, and their answers aren't satisfying to us anymore because their answers rely so much on faith that it's not about the specifics of the Book of Abraham problems or the specifics of Book of Mormon geography problems or all those things. It's big picture. There's a faith that this is God's church, even if it's imperfect. And that's so frustrating for somebody who no longer accepts faith as a valid place to rest your conclusions. But that's us. That's where we are. And I don't think that it's reasonable to superimpose that value system onto them and to then say they're deficient, they're lacking in this area, because they do the same thing with us, and they say that we're deficient in what it takes to accept these things as true. We're deficient in the faith area. So, we're coming at this from very different perspectives. There's an abyss between us, and I talk about this in the course of the panel discussion. But these are things that I've had on my mind since Friday when we first started doing this. So sorry for the long insert and rant right here, but I'm the one that's editing this stuff. I've been working on this for like 4 days now, and this is the way that I want to frame it, okay? So this is what we're doing.
Okay. And as far as you know, is it my understanding is it's legal in Utah to record
It is.
if at least one party knows that the recording is happening.
Yes, absolutely. And that was one thing that I looked into the day that we were talking about whether we should release this or not. So it is legal.
Okay. All right, Trevor. Well, I really appreciate it. I think this is going to be an important interview to sort of show in 2017 where premium elite Mormon apologetics are, where the general authorities are, and where the church is and where it isn't. I think there's a lot of really powerful things in that interview that we're about to discuss with some amazing people. So Trevor, thanks for joining us. Please keep in touch. All right.
Thanks again, guys.
All right. Beautiful. Okay, everybody. It's time for the SmackDown Mormon Stories style. And who better to do a SmackDown than two of the Infants on Thrones crew plus the brilliant Lindsay Hansen Park. So let's just do a quick introduction, and we'll do ladies first, if that's okay. So Lindsay Hansen Park, why don't you just quickly introduce yourself and tell everyone all the good things they need to do and follow that you're involved with?
Am I the token lady on this podcast? Is that what it is?
No, you're not. You're brilliant, and that's why you're here.
My name is Lindsay Hansen Park. As John mentioned, I am the assistant director for Sunstone. I'm not speaking as Sunstone today. I'm just speaking as myself. I'm also the host of the Year of Polygamy podcast, where we cover the history of Mormon polygamy from the beginning until now. So I have some thoughts about the polygamy comments today.
I bet. I was thinking of you quite a bit. Well, Lindsay, welcome, and support Sunstone. That's my little plug. All right. So, Glenn, since you're the boss of Infants on Thrones, do I have to introduce you before I introduce John Hamer? Is that the way it works? Is there a patriarchy in Infants on Thrones?
We do everything in appointment order. We have to follow each other through.
That's great. Glenn,
No,
tell us.
but if I think we're going in a scale from most feminine to least feminine, it's appropriate to have me follow Lindsay because John Hamer is a man's man,
Okay.
much more than I am.
All right.
So I don't know. What do you? I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask Tyler some questions. It's Tyler, right? No, it's Trevor. I mean, we've said it like a million times. Trevor. His name is Trevor. Get with the program, man. Is that his name?
He actually explicitly asked me not to include him in the panel. So sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll respond in text. But
All
just
right.
introduce yourself, Glenn, and tell
I
us
am
why you're awesome.
I am not awesome.
Okay.
So
But Infants on Thrones is your podcast, right? Along with several other cool people.
we've got 9 infants on thrones that we have a lot of fun with that. So
All right. Well, welcome back to Mormon Stories. This
Thank
is not
you.
your first appearance, I should
No.
note, nor Lindsay's. All right.
it's my
Welcome,
first
Glenn.
visual appearance.
That's right. You look handsome. You're looking Phoenix area
No, I
has been
don't.
good for you.
Okay.
All right. And Lindsay, you've got some hair color going on.
Yes, I do. I got it dyed red right before I went down to Colorado City, so I looked like a Gentile, quite like a Gentile. So
You're looking great. Looking great. All right, John Hamer. You look great as well. So all three of you look great. And John, introduce yourself.
Well, I've been on several of your programs. We've been friends for a whole long time, and also supporter of Sunstone. You and I and Lindsay are getting together here in Toronto, which is where I live, for a Sunstone very soon, and looking forward to that. I do a bunch of work.
April, what are the dates? April what?
April 8th, right?
Yeah,
I should be plugging this properly. So Saturday, April 8th.
in
And
Toronto.
it's here in Toronto, and then a lot of people are getting together the night before to go see Book of Mormon the musical. So anyway, it's a wonderful.
And the day after, Sunday morning, we're going to attend one of your services at Community of Christ.
So a lot of people are going to come and see, well, what on earth could John Hamer's church be like? And so you can come to my congregation if you so choose.
All
So
right.
yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, John. All right, I really have nowhere to begin, but Glenn, you really were jumping up and down. So do you want to start?
Well, I wanted to talk to him about what he really expected to come out of that sit down interview with the questions, and he mentioned, in the wrap up there, that he really did want to believe. He was hoping that they would give him something that could help him with his belief.
I would need to rebuild that bridge somehow. And that's what I was hoping they might be able to help me with. Because it's not like I need to see an angel of God to tell me this is true. But I just need at least the other half of the bridge to be able to bridge that gap.
I'm going to be a little bit skeptical about that. I don't know. Maybe he really is sincere that he feels that that's what he wanted. But I didn't, as I was listening to this, I didn't hear any times where he was taking what they were offering him and he was accepting it or, really considering it. It was kind of like the same stuff. Oh, I've heard that. I can dismiss that and move on to another thing. And so a lot of the notes that I wrote are kind of along those lines where I just feel like it gets to a certain point where it comes to faith. Like, you're either going to accept these things because your faith says, yeah, I'm going to believe in this or true, or you're going to say, no, I need more than faith. And when you've got two different people who are expecting different types of discussions, I don't think that it really goes anywhere. So that's kind of my overall response.
John,
Okay.
Lindsay, then John.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Hamer. So yeah, I was writing notes too, and I'm just going to kind of look at these. First of all, I was really impressed with Matthew Grove's kindness in the interview, and this has been consistent with my experience with church historians. I think these guys are really great. They know their stuff, probably more than the interview even reflected, and which is kind of a bummer that he didn't know that it was being recorded. I think that it wouldn't have changed the answers much, but I think that they really are put in a difficult situation. He led with, I don't know if you guys remember, but he led with the idea of truth is everywhere.
Truth is everywhere.
Right.
Truth. There's truth in Islam. There's truth in Buddhism. Confucius was a great spiritual teacher.
Right.
Trying to find some common ground, like Glenn was saying. And that's absolutely factual in the historical sense. There are quotes from our leaders saying that truth is everywhere. I'm wondering if there's a better approach in this interview, because like Glenn pointed out, I think that the stated purpose was to maybe talk about some historical concerns and then
The church historian
would address those and then everybody would be okay. But we've been in this business long enough. We know that that's not really what was happening in this interview. With respect to
the general authority,
I think that he was hoping that maybe there would be an answer and it would be resolved and everyone would say, oh, I can't believe I never saw it that way before. I would give advice to anyone who is in this situation, talking to someone with doubts or who has concerns. When you're dealing with someone who's doubting, who's lost their faith, you lead with validation first, always. And of course,
the church historian
did this a little bit. He tried to validate that the CES letter has some historical facts and things like that. But when you feel betrayed by the church, like, you already have the facts you need. I mean, people go into like a 2-month, in my case, it was like a 5-year deep dive into church history. And it's not like, you hear this with my Year of Polygamy podcast. At the very beginning, I promise that if we have enough context, it's going to make this okay. And actually, the more context we get, the worse it gets. And so I almost feel like what you need to do is not try to fix the facts. You hyper validate. It's like you have to overcorrect with validation. And I wonder if he would have come in and he would have said, here are my problems. And they would have said, yeah, you know what? It sucks. It's really bad. I'm sorry. If that would have had a better approach rather than, yeah, that's true. But here are some ways that I look at it. I don't know that is effective.
Emotional validation.
Effective in achieving what?
Well, I'm assuming that the goal would be to either first, take care of Trevor or keep him in the church. And, I just wrote this about the Book of Abraham too. Trevor's saying that he looks for answers. He wants answers, but really Trevor at this point already knows the answers. Mm-hmm. He already knows the Book of Abraham. I don't think context is going to convince him. I think if they would have said something like, you know what, it's a mess. All of us in this church are collectively trying to sort this out right now. It's a trial for our generation. We don't have a good answer. We're all coming to a reckoning with our faith. Maybe Trevor, maybe you can help us. You're the one in the seat right now. What would you suggest? Inviting him in, because really I think that this is a conversation about identity. It's not a conversation about correcting the facts. Once you read the CES letter, it's not like you can critique maybe his approach or his methodology or his scholarship, but at the end of the day, you can go somewhere else and find good, accurate scholarship on these issues and that back up what, Jeremy Reynolds is writing. And you're not going to fix those. There's not enough context or finagling or Terrell Givens' approach that are going to straighten the facts how you needed them to be. That's not what I think Trevor was looking for. That's my opinion.
John Hamer, let's bring you in. What were you going to say?
Well, it's too late for what I was going to say. Now there's another whole thing on the topic. So based on what Lindsay was going to say.
No, let's have you have an opening statement. What was your reaction? What was the first thing you wanted to say after listening?
Well, what I was going to say before was reacting to Glenn. Now I would be reacting to Lindsay. If I'm going to go back to what I was going to say, it would be something different. I mean, I guess I didn't know what we were going to be listening to when you said, "Hey, let's have do you want to do something be on a podcast? It's going to be something real cool." I said, "Sure." So anyway, so it was very interesting to listen through this, to be able to hear the recording, to hear how people are trying to work through it. I thought that
the church historian, or in other words, which is to say, the historian of the church.
I thought he had approached this. He was in a very, I think, a quite earnest way. I mean, I think he was most everything that he was sharing was, academically defensible. I mean, there are a couple places where he's sending him to Sorensen and referencing the missing papyrus theory, neither of which are clearly not what
the church historian
is hanging his testimony on or whatever. But in other words, that's just in our arsenal. You can maybe go over there too. Those are not particularly defensible directions, but in general, everything that he was talking about was pretty reasonable. But it was clear to me that so all the different things that Lindsay was suggesting that they do, and it wouldn't that have been working better and all that kind of thing. I think that the problem here is that the person who was running the meeting and whose agenda it was, who put it together, the member of the 70, it was very clear he had no idea what the problem was, and so because he himself doesn't understand the problem or the issues, he's just aware, well, we've got smart people on our side. That's as well as he knows it. And so then his goal then at a certain point is to simply say, well, the person who's the head of the anti-Mormon church over here has an agenda, and you either going to believe them or you're going to believe us, and that's pretty well as how he's framed it. And so he just wants to say, well, it's muddy everywhere, and that's all you have to worry about, right? And then see whose side it is to be on. But so that's, I think, why they couldn't possibly have led it the other way. I think that if you were...
The church historian was holding a meeting.
Himself, and he'd brought him, he would have probably done it quite differently.
Yeah. So here's what I'm hearing so far from everyone. Glenn, I don't know, is it fair to say, Glenn, you're questioning Trevor's motives, that he wasn't upfront, or that he was disingenuous in some way? Is that your opening concern?
Yes, but I was trying to be really, really nice about it.
Well, I'm sorry that was my opening concern. That's what I led with. That that's what I wanted to talk to him about before he jumped off. That was the reason I said that.
Did his first hour show you any sincerity, heartfelt desire to seek truth? Did you see the part where he cried about how he didn't want this to happen? And
oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm not doubting his sincerity as a person. And his experience of leaving the church over the last, what did he say it was? It's pretty recent. It's within 6 months, a year.
Couple years.
Yeah. And so, for me, I've been out a lot longer, and so it may be my own arrogance that's looking at this and going, oh, I recognize that stage, where I'm like, okay, I've learned all this stuff. It's rocked my world. I want to have a conversation with people and test out these new ideas, but also I want them to know. And so I think they're and I'm projecting myself onto Trevor at this point, which isn't fair to Trevor, but it's all I can do in that situation. If I was sitting there having this conversation with those two guys, I would have been wanting to drop everything that I know to kind of not really trip them up, but to get a response from them, especially if I'm recording it and I know, okay, this is going to be on record. And regurgitating, and it's still part of, I think, him working through all of this himself. But I don't get the sense that there was really anything that they could have said to him that would reverse the course that he had started months earlier.
Yeah,
and the way that he was interpreting the information.
I relate to him because I was able to meet with Elder Holland twice.
Yeah,
and during those two meetings, honestly, it's true that I was skeptical that Elder Holland was going to resolve any of my concerns. And in fact, he didn't at all. In fact, he raised more concerns. But I don't think it's fair to say that I wasn't open, or even that Trevor wasn't open. When I listen to Trevor, I hear him paying attention to what they say. I hear him processing it. And I did hear several points where he was like, okay, that's a fair concern. I can see what you're saying. But
weren't those always followed up with a but?
Well, yeah, but that's because is it also possible that they were not satisfactory answers?
Absolutely, and that's my point. That I don't think that there was anything that they could have said to him that would have changed the way that he
and
thought
all
about
I'm
things.
saying is
that's because
it's still possible. I'm just saying it's still possible to go into those meetings doubtful and skeptical that people are going to have an answer, but still hoping for it. And I believe that I was hoping for it when I went to Holland. I still stayed in the church years after Holland disappointed me. But I was hoping for it. And I think I would have been sincerely grateful if he had given something, which he didn't do. John Hamer.
Right.
I was just going to say it's because we're maybe from this perspective aware that there's nothing that they could say, but you maybe until you actually have had them, until you get to the point where you are aware, or you know there's nothing that they could say, that you do know, you might still hope that there's something they could say. And so actually I thought that the places where the one of the core places where they were losing him in the interview would be always when would this faith component that you were talking about, or that Glenn is talking about, that this not having that be able to be bridged, and that's where it ends. So in other words, when they would admit, would instead of saying, okay, no, it is this literal black and white, God is communicating directly to the prophet kind of thing, kind of as you've always envisioned it, as two people talking to each other, and they're saying, no, it's not really like that. So where they would use these kind of jujitsu ways of stepping away from making those kind of stronger faith claims, then that would then divide them further, because then he said, and that I think what he was always circling back to, which was, okay, I could believe all these things, but there's nothing. But he was like describing it as, when you take the truth component out of it, or whatever, when you take that core faith claim component out of it, then what's there? That's I think.
And that was Lindsay, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I think I agree with all of you. I get to Glenn's point. I agree with him in the sense that, not that I'm questioning Trevor's motives at all, but I think when you're in that situation, you really do. It's sincere that you think that you're hoping for an answer to this, but somewhere deep down in your heart, you already know the answer now, that maybe the Book of Abraham isn't a literal translation. Right. So anything at this point, anything that that doesn't sound, that isn't validation, sounds like an apology. And I think that is where the leadership really needs to get real about this. The essays are a good step, I guess, but really what needs to happen is not a better explanation about the Book of Abraham. That sounds like an apology. What needs to happen is validation, inclusion. How do we accept people into our identity who have found out these things? Those are the things that are not being addressed. And in
the church historians'
defense, he was brought in to clarify these facts, but I think that it could have gone a lot further if he would have said, yeah, you're right. I've had church historians say that to me, and it's so validating to be like, yeah, this is a mess. I don't know. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. Yeah. Because that, to me, Trevor, that's what Trevor is really asking. He's hoping that the facts will back it up, but we all know that they won't.
Well, Lindsay, you're making a great point. Validation is always the way to go. That's like psychology 101. If you're going to be a therapist, you just listen empathetically and show unconditional positive regard. That will get you 70% of the way there in all of therapy. You don't even need an empirically supported form of therapy if you believe in what you're saying. You just show love and empathy, and people are going to feel great about it. I'm just going to disagree with you guys on one small point. When you're meeting with the wizard,
We want to see the wizard, but nobody can see the great Oz.
When you're at Oz, meeting with the wizard, people that have unrestricted access to everything, if they were to come up with, actually, we have a new DNA study that we've conducted that shows this or that, or actually, if I could take you back to the vault, here's a piece of evidence that shows this or that. I think it's still reasonable to say, all right, I'm going to make sure with the people at the very top that there's nothing I haven't heard. And in that sense, they didn't produce. And so it's a way to sort of say, okay, I've seen the wizard. I stood behind the curtain. I got to ask my questions, and they got nothing.
Well, I'm going to jump in again and insert myself to push back on John's pushback, because I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that a general authority is going to take the time that people in a faith crisis have taken to study out all of the issues and to really try to understand them front and backwards, just because there's people out there that are doing this and need their support with it. It would be nice if they did that, and it would be nice if in the course of doing that they were able to find some kind of an answer that was actually satisfactory to people going through a faith crisis. But they're not going through a faith crisis. They accept this stuff. They believe this stuff. Why would they go in? For them, it's simple, and they don't understand why it's not simple for us. They don't understand why are you filling your head with all of this stuff? It's just making things harder for you. I mean, you've heard those kinds of arguments, right? That's sincere. We need to accept that and not say, oh, you guys are doing a disservice because you're not doing this the way we want you to. I think that that's an unreasonable position for us to take. And I also think it's unreasonable to pull in this general authority, who is one of how many general authorities do we have in the church, and say, okay, this represents what the church thinks, or this church historian, and say, okay, well, this represents the church's answers on these things. It's just putting those people in an unfair position. And for those of us who say what is really interesting to us or what's really important to us is the truth, I think we're ignoring the truth of their lived experience, and we're not accepting the truth of their reasons for believing in the church. We're rejecting that. We're saying those are stupid reasons. We don't reject that. And then how can we expect to have any kind of a common ground conversation with them? So that's my pushback on John's pushback, and I'm able to do that because I'm editing this episode for a second time, given all the circumstances. So there you go.
Now, having said that, Lindsay, I think you're 100% right that validation is the way to go. Let me move to
before we move off. Before we move off of validation, because validation is great. Is it realistic in a situation where you've got a group of very staunch believers and somebody who's come to the conclusion that I'm not believing this, I'm not buying these arguments, and he's seen them, that you can really validate each other? So, I mean, what would that look like for, and I'm forgetting their names. I'm sorry, I'm spacing it out, but
the general authority and historian.
For them to validate Trevor, because Grow did do that, say, oh yeah, I get that, I've heard that, there was that, but he can't validate what Trevor really wants him to validate, which is your conclusion in studying all these things indicates that there really is a problem, and there's no solution to that problem except to leave the church. I think they can validate up to a point to say, yes, this is a problem, and this is where you need to have faith to fill in the gap. And if Trevor said, okay, yeah, I can have faith that fills in the gap, then Trevor would have to validate that faith is an acceptable stopgap, but he's not willing to validate them there. And so that's where I feel like that you can validate up to a point, but where it really takes hold in a situation like this, it's not therapy. A situation like this, I don't know where it is. So I'd love to be instructed here. How can you get the validation at that level?
Lindsay?
I want to push back on one of your points, which is
cool.
You're saying that you can't validate, you can't agree with each other. This is what I disagree with, is the part where you said, well, he can't validate.
The church historian
cannot validate the idea of, well, there is a problem in the history, so the only solution is to leave the church. That's the problem, that is our only acceptable choice, is to leave the church. What I think would save pain, would save suicides, would save families breaking up, is if we could say, yeah, there's a problem. Let's figure it out, rather than, yep, I guess you have to leave now because you didn't figure out the facts. And now we're to a point in the church development with this information that most people leave, and there is support, and it's not as bad as it was even 5 years ago. So I'm not trying to say that leaving the church is like, a choice that shouldn't have to be made, because clearly it's a good choice for a lot of people. But what I'm saying is, this is where we're getting stuck on the old narrative that the LDS Church has given us for so long, that if you don't fall in line, you're out. And that's kind of what we hear
the general authority
hearing too. And he can't even let his mind accept that there's a problem. So I agree there. They're not going to, I mean, they would have to start on the basis that there's a problem. Trevor is saying, hey, there's a problem.
And then the general authority, he's all like,
Is like, well, there's probably not. Just talk to someone smarter.
Right.
That's not a conversation. But
the church historian
knows this. He knows that there's a problem. And like you said, I think he handled it well, but I think to argue on the points of history is a mistake because that is not where the solution lies to me.
Right. All right. This is great. Let's jump into some of the content. The first point I wanted to talk about was he started out wanting to talk about epistemology and then kind of the one true church problem.
And I guess my main sense of that would be that I think sometimes the rhetoric in the church has been, or can be taken to be that we are the only true church and we are the only one with truth.
Right.
But I think that if we look throughout church history, I mean, there's very clear prophetic statements that truth is everywhere.
Right.
Truth. Yeah. There's truth in Islam. There's truth in Buddhism. Confucius was a great spiritual teacher.
Right.
I think one way to even look at Joseph Smith or to think about him was that he was willing to sort of get truth from wherever he could find it.
Yeah.
Right. So for example, one issue that kind of trips people up sometimes is Masonry. Right. And my take on that would be that Joseph saw some truth in Masonry, takes it, incorporates it into larger truth. Right. So he's looking for truth everywhere he goes, and I think that we should be doing the same. Right. I mean, there's truth in all the great world religions. We shouldn't be scared of that. And then certainly I think what the church would say is unique is the sort of authority piece, right? The priesthood piece on top of that.
Right.
One thing I noticed is I got the sense that
the church historian
was focusing on the sense that the church pulls truth and sees truth everywhere, but the
church historian
did not want to actually answer the question about the one true church. And I've listened to this twice now.
Yeah, I've listened to it like 5 times.
What I heard him say is, if you want that issue of the one true church addressed, talk to
our general authority friend over here.
But that's not going to be coming from me. Did you guys hear that? And do you think it's safe to ask or wonder whether
the church historian himself
isn't necessarily wed to this idea of one true church? Did anybody catch that, or is that something no one really?
He clearly, I mean, he actually in that whole thing, he actually volunteered Joseph Smith thinking there's truth in Masonry, right? So he was actually, that's a bold, I don't know, example of finding truth everywhere, since Masonry doesn't have any ancient antecedent or anything like that. It's something that is invented in late medieval, more likely early modern times, and so therefore it doesn't go back to Solomon and all that kind of thing. And you're kind of admitting that that's at the core of contemporary, or if you actually take people down that path, you would say, well, that's where Joseph Smith got a lot of this temple stuff. And so in other words, finding truth wherever it may be. But then the one place that he didn't address it then is he says, okay, well, we always have thought, therefore, that there's truth everywhere. And then he says, but what's unique is the church's authority claim. And then he didn't follow that up, and actually nobody followed that up.
Well, I heard him say, I heard him say, I can't speak to that.
You got to talk to the general authority
to speak to that.
Yeah, the church's unique claim of authority. So in other words, that's where he's like, in other words, there's truth all over the place, but the unique thing is this authority claim, and that's really the whole thing that it's all coming down to.
And I didn't hear
the general authority
address it. So at the 18-minute mark, he says,
feel free to weigh in, O general authority friend of ours, and the general authority friend of ours just did not.
No answer. Right. Lindsay or Glenn, do you make anything of that, or was it not something that struck you?
I mean, I think it's sincere. My experience with all LDS academics or academics that study Mormonism, I would say that they have very similar approaches to this. It's a more universalist, dualistic approach. I think that scientific, classically trained historians will, and John Hamer can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's the method being taught in academia. So I didn't hear that and be like, oh, that's some new radical shift in church ideology. I think that that's pretty consistent where scholars...
Are you kind of saying that
the historian?
was acting as a historian, not as a church authority, so he wouldn't speak about the one true church. Is
Yeah,
that what
I
you're
mean,
saying?
he led with that. He said, "This is my role. I'm the
Okay.
historian,"
Yeah.
which I think is another academic responsibility that he has. And the problem with all of us, and we come by it honestly, so this is not to blame the victim, but if you have a church name badge on, if you work for the church, we expect that validation. And that's why I'm saying it's probably wrong-headed for the system to expect that
The church historian
somehow magically solve this guy's problems. What they really need from anyone who wears a church badge is validation.
Yeah. Glenn, did you have a quick comment?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how quick it's going to be, but I'll try. I think that it's fair to infer from what we listened to that
the church historian,
he's aware of this as a problem for ex-Mormons, the one true church claim. And what he was trying to do was say, it doesn't have to be black or white, that one church is true and all the rest of them are false, but it could be that there's truth in all of them, so it's a way of softening that problem. And so in that sense, I think he was validating, he was showing an awareness of the concern, he was validating a little bit, and he was offering, even though he's saying, I'm a historian, this isn't really my specialty where I can help you, I'll tell you how I've reconciled this. I think that was where his answer was, and that it's not that it's all or nothing. It's that we just have 100% and everybody else has, 70, or something like that. But 70 is not bad. So don't think that it's such a harsh claim that we're a one true church. Maybe that would help you stay, or something like that. So I thought that's what his response was.
Sure. Okay. That makes sense. And I just do wonder, some of the comments on the Facebook live stream were basically saying that
this church historian guy is a New Order Mormon.
That he's certainly more like, I would have been 7 years ago, which is like, the church isn't true with a capital T, but there's truth in it. And we have our own divine mission, but other churches are true too. And we're all, there's many paths of Mount Fuji. Do any of you guys think that it's off limits to speculate reasonably
that this church historian
might be sort of more New Order Mormonish than Orthodox? Anybody have a thought?
The answers that he gave, we'll get to it in the book of Abraham, right?
Let's go to that.
So you read the book of Abraham essay?
Yeah, okay. I did. And it didn't quite, like there was some justification there is how I saw it, but it didn't quite answer it 100% for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But talk to me a little bit about that.
Let me just kind of give you my perspective on Abraham, right? So we know that the problem is that on a surviving scrap of papyri, and of course we have to remember we've only got 10 or 11 of these scraps of papyri. Everything else is gone, destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire and all this kind of thing. On one of the surviving scraps of papyri is part of facsimile 1, right? And we know then that what we know as facsimile 1, Egyptologists would say, is a funerary text. Right. And we know as well that the scrap that we have of papyrus doesn't date to Abraham's time.
That's right.
Right. It dates to the 1st century BC or 1st century AD, around there.
Right.
So that's the core problem, right?
Yes.
And I think there's two basic ways to think about it, right? One is that maybe Joseph had other things, so we know he had these scrolls of papyri. Maybe, and we know the other scraps of papyri don't seem to have anything to do with Abraham. Right. So one response.
So maybe
is,
there was maybe that's what I read is that we're seeing what we have.
Right.
But it's so minimal in what Joseph may have
compared to what he had. We know there's good descriptions that he has rolls of papyrus, and we know we just have some scraps. For me, the more persuasive way to think about Abraham, and I think this goes along with sort of Joseph's career as a translator, if we can use that kind of terminology.
Yes. Yeah.
So we know he has two impulses when he encounters an ancient text. One impulse is more what we would term a scholarly impulse, or more of a kind of a traditional translation impulse, and one is more of a spiritual impulse. So when he gets the Book of Mormon, one of his impulses is to take some of the characters to a scholar and say, do these match up? Right. That's the kind of the Charles Anthony story.
Right.
And of course, we know then the other is this kind of spiritual impulse. When he wants to translate the Bible. Produce what we call the inspired version of the Bible, right? So he's reading through. We know that he's consulting scholarly works as he does that, right? He's got biblical commentaries.
Of course.
And
he grew up...
Right.
Yeah, he grew up in a very Protestant-heavy, people doing the tours. And, he knew the Bible a lot more than we give him credit, I think.
Right. And so then his other impulse is he claims that, he says that some of the Bible revision is just coming through straight revelation. Right. So for example, the Book of Moses, which is kind of the twin book in the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Abraham. How does the Book of Moses come? Joseph just says it comes.
Yeah, it's just revelation.
So he's working on the Old Testament with the Bible revision, and then it comes as revelation. Right. So there's kind of the scholarly impulse. He's trying to study some things out, and then he says it comes through revelation. So fast forward a few years, and of course Joseph is fascinated by ancient languages. Right. He talks about can we recover the Adamic language? Right. There's this real interest in language. He studies Hebrew. Right. All this. He studies Hebrew. He studies Greek. All this. Sort of thing. What does he do when he gets the papyrus? They try to figure it out.
Yeah, he treats it more of a scholarly kind of...
Yeah, initially that seems to be very much what they're doing. So we have a set of records that we call the Kirtland Egyptian papers.
Right.
They're mostly in the hands of Joseph's scribes, but Joseph has some writing on those pages as well. And it seems like what they're doing is they're copying characters from the papyrus, trying to figure out how they might relate to each other. And of course, at this point, no one can read Egyptian. Right, the Rosetta Stone is like 10 years earlier, and just no one knows about it. Right, so they're trying to kind of puzzle this out.
Yeah,
and then the Book of Abraham comes, and so another way to think about it is that the papyrus is the catalyst for the revelation, and the revelation. The text of Abraham may be on the papyrus, or it may not be. Right? But,
I could see how.
But the papyrus sort of catalyzes a Book of Moses type experience.
It kind of sparks, sparks the topic, and then he consults and gets spiritual revelation and creates a work around it.
And one problem that we have with almost understanding almost all these issues is that we wish we had more records on them. Right. So Joseph never tells us how he gets the Book of Abraham.
Right.
He never tells us how he translates it. Even his scribes tells us very little about the Book of Abraham. Wilford Woodruff tells us a few years later that maybe he uses Urim and Thummim or his tear stone on it. One of the scribes says he just dictated by sort of the power of God. Right. And so I think those are the two basic ways that people would think about it. One is that, maybe it's just not there because we don't have.
Right.
And the second is this could be just a funerary text. Or it could be a funerary text that, it's 2 millennia later from Abraham, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't contain writings of Abraham, right? It gets passed down over time or something like that.
Right.
But maybe the funerary text is the catalyst by which Joseph receives
and that's basically what the papers say,
Right.
And I can see that perspective.
Yeah.
I can see that. You know what I mean? It's just unfortunate that everything that we have as a testable, item to test his translation abilities is proven a fraud. And so it's
I'd say it's untestable.
Well,
which is a different sort of question than that is fraud.
And by the way, calling this thing a fraud to someone who you know is a believer isn't a way to really engage on the same level, because he's not going to agree that it's a fraud. Anyway,
let's talk about the two theories.
Thing, right?
Joseph as scholar versus Joseph, spiritual impulse versus scholarly impulse. Talk about that, John.
Right. And so, I thought that was one of the answers that he kind of spent the most time trying to explain. And so he was presenting the LDS apologetic arsenal. And so essentially he says, well, we're not going to totally throw out here the missing papyrus theory that some people would like to have, which I think is pretty irrelevant and isn't going to go anywhere. But then he actually didn't say that was where he was at. So like you say, he said that what we always see with Joseph Smith, who is an intellectually curious guy, who wasn't like Brigham Young, who just thought all book learning was bad. He was actually a guy who, wherever he had the opportunity to, he wanted, they made the school of the prophets of the apostles. They hired a rabbi or a Hebrew teacher anyway to be able to teach them Hebrew. He wanted to learn that stuff, and they were trying to in the Joseph Smith's Egyptian grammar, and that they were trying to put that try to figure out Egyptian in that kind of a sense. Although even then it is no clear cut, though it shouldn't be thought of as being like completely separated, like there's the scholar Joseph Smith and the prophet Joseph Smith. It's all intertwined in him, I should think. But anyway, that it comes up with the proposal, though. He's saying, well, look, what if we see, though, the Book of Abraham as the papyrus is merely being catalytic. So in other words, that this is another kind of direct revelation where Joseph Smith is the source here of the text entirely, and it's not actually any kind of translation in an academic sense. And so that's quite a nuanced view that isn't probably going to be printed in a CES manual anytime soon, right? And so if you're saying, does that make you a more nuanced, sophisticated LDS position, that's where he's at, it looks like.
It seems to be a lot of the comments on Facebook were that Joseph did claim to be really translating. And this is something that really struck me last week or the week before. Bushman Givens, Jana Reese, Mark Brown, Rosalind Welch, Patrick Mason, they all descend on Utah State University, and they spend a whole day Phil Barlow was there. They spent a whole day redefining the term translation, trying to say translation doesn't mean translation. And Joseph didn't even necessarily mean translation when he said translation. Translation can be all sorts of other things that then allows the scriptures to still be valid, even if they're not historical. And my question is there evidence that Joseph meant translation when he said translation? And are they being a little bit muddying the waters a little bit?
It's probably said, a lot of things that Joseph Smith says are said with deliberate nuance. In other words, he says things that there are multiple answers to, and he may well say he's legally meaning the one, but he's also then consciously trying to get people to hear the other. So that certainly happens when he uses phrasing that's nuanced. But I would say in this case with the word translation, I think that there's a lot of evidence to see that Joseph Smith is maybe thinking of something quite different in terms of translation than what we think of today, or what the LDS Church recently has ever kind of presented this kind of thing as, because this word that they use at the time, they use it biblically to say, like, the city of Enoch is translated from earth up to heaven, that Moses's body is translated and it becomes an eternal body. In other words, they use that word translated. If you read the early patriarchal blessings that Joseph Smith Sr. gave to early members, he says, "Thou shalt have the power to translate thyself from planet to planet." And so what he means by translate in that case is not that you're going to turn your body into a digital whatever, some kind of other language. It means that you're going to teleport it from space to space. And so it is completely, I think, defensible to say that the idea here is you are taking something from the spiritual realm and bringing it to the physical realm, and that may well be in other words, as opposed to an academic translation. So I would agree with them in that conference, and to that extent.
So to say that Joseph Smith ever gave the impression that he was looking at a character in a foreign language, figuring out what it literally meant, and then translating that into English. Joseph,
they're also doing that.
Did Joseph give the impression that he was doing that with the Book of Mormon, or with the papyri, with the plates or the papyri?
Yeah, he's doing that with both, because he also gives out characters, which he says are these characters that he says are on the Book of Mormon plates. And so the idea is that those are an actual character language. And then with the Egyptian, like Matt Groh was mentioning, they produce this entire Egyptian language and grammar where they create what they think of as a system for Egyptian and how it would work. And they take a character from the hieroglyphic, from the papyrus that they have, and then they try to create a system for it. But their understanding of hieroglyphics is completely wrong. It's this idea that everybody had in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, that Egyptian language is entirely magical. And so each one of these little glyphs can be a whole paragraph. And that is actually, and their basis for that, then those same things that are happening in those glyphs, a lot of those same phrases enter into the Book of Abraham text as we have it. So it is not a completely separate thing like they like to do. It's intertwined.
Glenn, what do you think about this?
Well, I don't even think that, I don't mean any insult to John Hamer, but I don't think you need a historian as well studied and smart as John Hamer is to answer the question that you're asking. You just need to look at the facsimiles that are in the Book of Abraham, because they're annotated. And Joseph Smith said in here, this place right here at number 1 says this. And the things that used to capture my imagination when I was a kid poring over this in sacrament meeting were the ones that would say, contains writings that cannot be revealed unto the world, but is to be had in the holy temple of God. And then figure 9, ought not to be revealed to the world at the present time. Figure 10 also. Figure 11 also. If the world can find out these numbers, so let it be. Amen. Just look at what's in the scriptures that are being published and circulated among Mormons today, and you can see that Joseph Smith was very literally assigning meaning to these characters and intentionally withholding and saying, oh, you're going to get more of this later. So to me, it's not really even a valid argument or a response to take the catalyst theory and to say that he wasn't working from that. But it doesn't, again, listen, and I'm going back to the question of validation. How do you show validation in a conversation like this when
the church historian
clearly saying, well, yeah, there's things like this, but you got to take it on faith, and you got to look at all the other scriptures that he did and what was Joseph Smith and put it into all this context. And he's taking this very apologetic approach to it, but it's so that he can validate or justify his faith. That's why I believe this. And they're never going to get to a point where he goes, oh yeah, you're right. Boy, the facsimiles in the Book of Abraham are just wrong.
Let me restate my hyperbole right there. It's not that they'll never get to that point. Maybe they will. Who knows? But I think it's unreasonable for one of us to expect in a conversation that in the course of that conversation they're going to come to that conclusion. Because if you base your beliefs on evidence and you're ignoring the evidence that they are believing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then you're not really pursuing truth and you're not really reading the evidence that's there, right? Because for him to say, yeah, you've got a really good point here. There are legitimate reasons to doubt the Book of Abraham. Like maybe they could say that, but then it calls their own faith into question. And I just think we all protect ourselves against that. We're blinded to our own flaws in those areas. Everybody is. I'm not just throwing this one guy on the bus. We're all like that. So I think we should be a little more tolerant of that in others.
Yeah, I'm pretty, and Lindsay, I want to bring you in here, but I'm pretty certain that Joseph Smith told people that these papyri were written by the hand of Abraham, if I'm not mistaken, that he believed that he told people that. And sometimes I just think Occam's razor applies. My nephew once said that nobody is postmodern about a label on the rat poison. You look at the words and you see what it is and you don't mess with it. And I think sometimes Occam's razor applies. And in the case of the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham, the use of the word translation, he meant to give people the impression that he was translating ancient records into English, and that's the end of story. And trying to expand the word translate to make it fungible, I think is just grasping for straws in a narrative that, and I like to say this, that if I went to Patrick Mason or Phil Barlow or Richard Bushman and said, I've received ancient records from somewhere and now I've translated them and look at what they mean. If there was a source translation for the original language, they would look at that. They would say that I was making it up, and they would say that I was a fraud. They wouldn't, add, give me credit for being able to channel some spiritual sort of knowledge, they would just say, John Dehlin is fooling people. He's a fraud. Ignore him. But they're willing to do that for Joseph Smith for whatever reason they are.
Okay, so soapbox time right now for editor's privilege, Glenn, right? So what did John just say?
But they're willing to do that for Joseph Smith for whatever reason they are.
For whatever reason. For whatever reason they are. You know, to me, these reasons, this is really what we should be talking about. This is what I'm really interested in, because we say things like this as if to say, you know, for some weird reason that makes absolutely no sense at all, Mormons keep believing all this stupid stuff because, well, they're not really interested in the truth, but we are. The truth is important to us. Really? We're so interested in the truth. So what about the truth that they really do have actual reasons for believing what they believe? They have important reasons. They have valid reasons. They have reasons that are much larger than any single factual discrepancy or even dozens and dozens of impossibilities. They've got real reasons, and it makes a real difference in their life. And I can't figure out what those reasons are and accept those reasons for them, even though I don't accept those reasons to base my own belief on. And if I can't take the time to look through them and understand them, that's my problem. That's my inability to look at the world through somebody else's eyes and to accept things that are foreign to me or even sometimes downright repulsive to me. That's my problem. It's my limitation. It's not theirs. Now, I have personally been way too quick to be dismissive of those reasons and to ridicule and to mock those believers. And you know, that's a major flaw in my character. And I'm super sensitive to this right now in this post-Trump world as I'm looking around and trying to figure out what the heck happened. That type of in-group, self-righteous arrogance and dismissiveness towards others, now it's natural. It's part of the reasons why we have groups. It's built into having groups that we would do that. But it's one of the major reasons that so many people are divided in our country right now, and it's really, really impacted me. So anyway, I just had to get up on that soapbox, and now I'll send you back to the conversation.
But they're willing to do that for Joseph Smith for whatever reason they are. Okay, Lindsay, what do you want to add?
Okay, I'm going to get all Mormon feminists for a minute, okay? Because when Mormon feminists talk about issues in the church, very rarely in feminist spaces are we talking about the Book of Abraham. So like when I'm hearing you guys talk about it, I'm thinking like, this is such a Mormon man conversation. And that's not derogatory. It's not derogatory. So, and certainly the Book of Abraham is an issue for a lot of women. That's not what I mean. But I'm just thinking like the way that you guys were taught and viewed to view the church was one way, right? And the way that women are taught to view the church is another way. So women are taught in the church that we don't have authority. We don't have the power. So we're always doing like these little shifts and moves to have it make sense. So I feel like women are almost more equipped to have more nuance in these things. And that's why the literalistic translation of Book of Abraham, I think, doesn't matter to a lot of women, because for us, it's a different approach. So I'm going to bring that into it. And again, I'm speaking generally and more about my experience too. So I'm not trying to project my stuff, but we're like arguing fact for fact. We're expecting, Glenn, when you're talking about validation, I think what you're saying is you're expecting Trevor to go in and be validated on the facts. That's not what I'm saying at all, because I think that's impossible. Let's throw the facts out. Let's say the Book of Abraham is garbage, that Joseph Smith made it up, whatever we want to say about that. There's this feminist thinker, Audre Lorde, who says this quote, that you'll never, for the master's tools, will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And that's what I feel like this whole conversation is contingent upon. We're trying to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. We're trying to say, well, look, they're being literal about the Book of Abraham and it doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work. Like Glenn pointed out, the facsimiles are being taught literally. The problem in the church for me is that we teach people to think about this literally. And now, you know, we're reaping what we sowed with that. And so we're trying to have this conversation where we're beating fact for fact, and it's not going to match up. It's not, because Joseph Smith, the way he saw the world, the way that he did things were shady. A lot of times they were shady. And I think Community of Christ has figured this out to say, well, why don't we, Joseph Smith, instead of making him this one-dimensional character, let's show that Joseph was, a revelator and a prophet and a seer, but he was also a fraud. And he was also sometimes, had sexual impulses, and sometimes he was a criminal. And making people more dimensional, I think, is the way to go. But even in this conversation, we're trying to beat them at their own game. And that game's done. That game was over a long time ago.
Well, Lindsay, I love that you're bringing in a feminist perspective. I love that you're saying there are lots of other things that are important than truth claims. That's absolutely true. I would just say that I think the truth claims do matter. I think this is all built on truth claims foundationally. That's what I think. And so I think both matter. I think the facts and the evidence do matter. I do think it tends to be a male conversation more than a female conversation. And I think what you're saying is true, which is there are 50 billion other things and sometimes way more important things that matter other than the truth claims.
I don't think I'm articulating this right. It's not, what I'm saying is it is built on the truth claims. But if you're expecting Trevor to go and get those truth claims validated, they're not.
You're saying it doesn't add up.
It won't add up. You're not going to find, because like you said, well, what if they have discovered magical DNA? Well, that would solve our DNA problem. That would solve one problem out of many, many problems. And that's what I'm saying. This approach, this whole conversation, like, to me, that the conversation was done once the record started coming out. So this is a problem that is not going to be solved. That's what I'm saying. So if we're looking for solutions, then there has to be a different approach. But you're not.
I just think it's reasonable to expect that if they're claiming steel swords and millions of bones and all these civilizations, it's reasonable to expect that there'd be evidence. And none of us are debating whether the Roman civilization existed because we have all the evidence. And so I think it's reasonable to try and find them. I think given the claims, the evidence should be there.
So if you have a very strong belief in God and you're a Mormon, is it also reasonable to think that maybe that evidence that you're looking for Book of Mormon geography does exist, but it's just hasn't been discovered yet?
Yes.
And so let's keep an open mind and put that one on the shelf. You know, I think when you're saying that facts matter, I get in trouble a lot on Infants on Thrones when I'm saying, no, they really don't matter. And people, what do you mean they matter? Well, they don't matter equally to everybody. You know, I mean,
that's
like
right.
there are people that care about it more than others. And so, I'm interested to hear more, and maybe we need to do this in a separate discussion, Lindsay, but talking about what validation is then, like because I think you're right. The type of validation.
This entire thing is not a conversation about facts. That is a conversation we have because that's the script the church gave us, is to talk about the truth claims. The whole conversation, when I heard that with Trevor, it's an identity conversation. It's Trevor saying, help me with this. You're my people. I've looked to you my whole life. I'm in pain. How are you going to make sense of this? My family's denied it. I'm here to get validation. Meeting with you gives me credibility to my family. This is the story I hear over and over and over with people, that facts become the language that we use. Mm-hmm. But what we're really saying is,
what about me?
What about me?
What about you?
Where does this leave me?
Well.
And so that is what I'm trying to say. I'm not giving advice to people going in or to even Trevor. I'm speaking to the Matthew Groves of the church. Like, if you want to have an effective conversation, it's not going to be with the facts. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's true. Lindsay, that's 100% true. I love it. You're bringing a beautiful perspective, and I agree. No, it's not going to end well. The best thing to do is to validate and show love and empathy, to kind of follow Christ's example, ironically. Just unconditional love and support and empathy. Try and get into people's mind and heart and see where they're coming from, and tell them that it makes sense that they feel the way that they feel, that they're not alone, that they're not crazy.
Wait, okay, cutting it again. Are we saying that we expect Mormons to do that for us, or are we saying that we're willing to do that for them? Question time.
And you're right, Lindsay, that is 100% what they should do. And I'm going to say that facts matter.
John, I'm really glad to hear you say that facts matter, because it makes me reconsider my position, and facts actually do matter. And, the fact is that we recorded this, we talked about this, and now I'm spending all this time going through and redacting the names of the general authority and the church historian, and I'm not going to do it anymore. So for those of you who have made it this far in the recording, way to go, you're initiated. Now you can find out who these people really are, because I'm not going to cover it up anymore. Because it's done. It's a fact. Facts matter. And what I mean by that is, of course, facts matter, but they're not the only consideration. There's a lot more that goes into people making decisions than just the facts, weighing all these other things. So anyway, I am just going to stop redoing this episode at this point and leave it how it was, and keep it up, and you guys can listen to it and comment on it. And I expect that at some point, probably in the next couple of days, John and Lindsay and I, and maybe Trevor as well, will all get together again and reflect on what this experience was for us and where we go from here. But until then, I'll lead the, like how meta has this gotten? Like my commentary upon the commentary that I was first asked to comment on. So whatever. It's a hobby, and I've been spending a lot of time on this particular one, and now I'm done, and that's a fact, and I can say that because facts do matter. And one final fact before I really do end this version of the edit and let you go on with the rest of the episode. At the end here, you're going to hear a very long, like hour and 20-minute Easter egg that is the recording that Trevor did with the historian and the general authority. And the main reason why I am not pulling this down the way that John's pulling it down from Mormon Stories is I don't think that there's anything in this conversation that is damning to either of these guys, either the church historian or the general authority. Nothing surprises me in what they said. I think it's informative. I think it can give people that vicarious experience of having that conversation with them. But what I really hope happens is that as you listen to it, you'll recognize how normal and like reasonable it is for them from the position that they're in to say the things that they're saying, and that really what we have is a disagreement about the role of faith in making conclusions on aspects like these. And I don't think that disagreement is going to be resolved, especially in conversations like this. So as you're listening to the church historian and the general authority, I hope that you'll be kind in your reaction to the things that they say, as they're sincerely trying to help Trevor with his stated concerns.
Really quickly, we don't want to belabor this, but do we want to talk at all about the Book of Mormon conversation? He mentions via the Hebrews and the late war. There was this interesting quote from Brigham Young that he pulls out, which is, I wouldn't be stumbled if the prophet translated 40 times and it was different each time. God speaks in the language of translations. Then he talks about Gibbons saying that God leaves things muddied so that there's a role for faith. And then, of course, Trevor responds by saying it's the church that muddies the concept of faith. Again, he's saying that logic and science and DNA and everything matters. It should matter. Are we now kind of beyond the point of even talking about that? Is that kind of the same conversation? Lindsay would probably say yes.
No, I mean, clearly, I listen, I think people might feel invalidated what I said. Facts matter to people, like you guys just brought up, because if that is how you hinge your testimony, then that makes sense. Mine was a heritage-based testimony. Mine was based on the pioneer stories and the feelings. So I come from a different perspective.
Sure. No. It's an important one. And there's many people like you. Gina talks about this all the time. Gina Colvin, the people of New Zealand, she gives us the impression they never took the Book of Mormon seriously in terms of a historical document. Isn't that kind of what Gina says too?
Yeah. But I mean, so people that have been hurt by the church, their adverse reaction is like, so stop trying to, apologize for the church. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying when we engage in this kind of fact for fact debate, I feel like that's the script the church gave us, because they're saying it's all true or it's all false. And I'm saying, I don't care if it's true or if it's false. Here's how it functions and here's what it serves in my life. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I don't care if it's true or if it's false. Here's how it functions and here's what it serves in my life. Here's how it functions and here's what it serves in my life. but I want to talk about polygamy. So
We're getting there. We're almost there.
I'm going to talk about polygamy.
Okay, Glenn or John, anything about Book of Mormon that you guys want to talk about, including his reference to Sorensen? John Hamer, you mentioned that earlier. Are you not a fan of Sorensen?
No.
Huh?
Yeah. So no, I'm not.
Why not? What's wrong with Sorensen? He's got a PhD and you don't.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's correct. I mean, Sorensen stuff is just really, 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 really horrible and bad. And I mean, it's just none of it's academically defensible. It's the kind of thing that Michael Coe called the lunatic fringe of Mayan, anyway, distortion. So that's just a bunch of misreading of the text, misreading of all the archaeological stuff and all of these kind of things. Anyway, so no, I don't think that would have been very helpful as a place to send anybody down. I also think that that whole part of it though was kind of muddy because at a certain point Trevor got accused of throwing the kitchen sink at everybody.
Yeah.
And so I think that once you do start coming down the whole thing, when you just I wanted to ask him, he really has read the entire thing of View of the Hebrews. That is a boring book. So so I don't know. But anyway, so I mean it's hard to defend the one thing about it, that I think people haven't actually gotten their hooks into very well is that the Book of Mormon, because of its literary dependence on the King James Bible, shows conclusively that it's a modern text. And so that's something that we don't take as one of these smoking gun things. People like Glenn was talking about the facsimiles. Yeah. Matt Groh actually said in there and admitted on the facsimiles, he says, no one disputes facsimile number one is not a direct translation Egyptologically, which is a pretty big concession, right?
Yeah.
So he actually threw that one under the bus or whatever. And I think that the other one is that they have to eventually come to terms with is literary dependence, which is to say we have a manuscript transmission of the transmission of the Bible through all the monks and everything like that. So we can tell which Bible manuscript comes from which exact Bible. And there's all the different variations and everything like that. The Book of Mormon not only quotes the Bible extensively, it also paraphrases it and reuses it. So the sermons are often paraphrasing Paul and things like that. Those paraphrases are literally dependent on the King James Bible. That's just completely anyway, so in other words, it means that it's a modern text conclusively. So that's an important one. So much more important than View of the Hebrews or the Late War or anything like that. So
Glenn?
I would wager to predict that if John Hamer had been right there next to Trevor and had said this to Groh and to Clark, it wouldn't have made a single dent in the way that Groh or Clark feel about, Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon.
Oh, yeah,
No, it would, because they're already committed to their faith in this. I think the one thing that came out in that section that I really liked that Matthew Groh said, Trevor brought up the View of the Hebrews. He brought up the other one, and he said, "Oh yeah, have you read them? Did you go read them? Go read it." Great advice. Everybody should do that. Yeah. Like any of these things that come up in the CES letter, that come up on podcasts, or that you read online, go test it out for yourself and see how it feels. And then don't just stop there, but do a textual analysis of the Book of Mormon, like John was just talking about. Do a textual analysis of the Book of Abraham. Do the things that are actually written in here, do they seem like something from 2,000 years ago? Does it seem like something from 200 years ago? I think there are answers to those kinds of questions, but you've got to be open to receiving an answer that the evidence is going to lead you to. And I think when you're so committed faithfully that this church is true, no matter what, you're at a disadvantage there. So so the facts don't matter in that case.
What? Yeah. Yeah. What about the point
so facts
where
don't matter?
Right. Yeah. And there's lots of comments from people on Facebook echoing that they love Lindsay, they love her perspective, and there's several people saying the facts matter. So I think both are true. I think
Donald Trump, man. Donald Trump is president of the United States. Facts do not matter.
Did I ever say that facts don't matter?
No, you did not. You did not.
Here's the thing. Here's the problem. Again, I'm going to say this again, and I hope I can articulate it. The hierarchical narrative, the narrative given to us by the
Joseph's narrative. Joseph's narrative.
Gordon Hinckley's narrative.
Joseph's narrative.
No, look, it's not only Joseph.
Matter. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say, he keeps on equating the current LDS narrative with Joseph's narrative as if the LDS Church isn't massively distorting the early history. The way Joseph Smith, I'm not going to defend Joseph Smith. There's all these things are also, I mean, if you want to use the facsimiles, he's got a smoking gun there of a direct mistranslation that shows he doesn't know a thing about translation. But his narrative is very different from contemporary LDS narrative. So if we're talking about right now for Lindsay, what's happening in a person's social context is how is the current hierarchy doing this, including distorting Joseph's narrative. So it's not just so don't.
Of course.
This is what I'm trying to say. If we hinge everything on facts, well, then we get to open ourselves up for 100 different scholars' interpretation. Well, here's what Joseph actually meant, and if you look at this source, then it says this and this and this. And I'm saying that conversation doesn't matter to me because that conversation is useful, and that to me strengthens the hierarchical narrative. Facts matter, of course they do. When I look, I did a Year of Polygamy podcast. I know a little bit about sorting through this stuff. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you rely on that argument to untangle this mess, you're just you're giving the church ammunition in this conversation. That's
Love it. That's brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. Brilliant. I totally agree. And we don't mean to make it sound like we're saying you don't think facts matter. We know you think that.
I hate truth and I hate facts.
Really quickly, was it disingenuous for Grow to point Trevor to Sorensen? Because they're all the way through it. Even Clark's argument was this was kind of the Nibley technique. It's like, oh, there's someone really smart that's thought through all this and they still believe. And so that's all you need to know. You don't really need to worry about it. Just trust the smart guy and you're good. Was it disingenuous for Grow to point him to Sorensen when we all know Sorensen is not legitimate as an archaeologist when he talks about the Book of Mormon?
I'm no expert on sort of Book of Mormon archaeology or things like that.
The DNA analysis, anachronisms, archaeological. I mean, why
have
would
you read the church's essay on DNA?
I have, and it's kind of like the book of Abraham, where it's like, okay, I could see it wasn't convincing to me, but if I were like, I'll just follow the Spirit on this one, kind of thing, then I could maybe look past it. But the fact that like there's zero, I mean, Jerusalem exists, you know what I mean? We have, the Roman Empire. We have so many just so much data pointing to the fact that those people actually at least lived. Right. And I think that faith comes in at that point where it's like, okay, Jesus Christ may have been an actual person, but I need to have faith to believe that he did all of the miracles that he did. That, to me, would be faith. Yeah. If there was no Jerusalem and there's no evidence pointing to that the people actually even existed, and it was a made-up fictional story, I don't think you would have nearly as many Christians in the world because it'd be a made-up story, and that's how I look at the Book of Mormon, is that if after, 150, going on 200 years, we don't have any archaeological evidence directly supporting the Book of Mormon, that to me is a big deal, because we're not talking a few 100,000 people. We're talking millions of people that, there was a war supposedly by Hill Cumorah that numbered in a couple million, And so where would maybe the bones and the hair, right? I mean, you would find that in the dirt, I think. But even if that went away, where's the armor and the swords and the, you know what I mean? Just anything. Right. So that's probably, if there were a smoking gun for me, that to me was boom, that was probably the domino that started everything else.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the big one.
Have you read John Sorensen's work?
Not as much as I would like to, but
because if I were channeling John Sorensen, I think he would say, actually, there's lots of archaeological or textual evidence that the Book of Mormon is an ancient book, right? There's traces in the book, or there's traces, and certainly there's no sort of remains that say this is Nephite, right?
Of course, but they're theories, though.
Yeah,
is what I see from Sorensen.
Sure,
there's theories, and this is where this could have happened,
right? And,
You know what I mean?
And there's lots of archaeological remains of people in the Americas.
Oh, of course.
Right.
Yeah, but not in the time of when the Nephites and the Lamanites would have lived. It's more like when I would go to the ruins.
Although
like
the Olmec
Chichen
culture
Itza.
is, in that same time period, right? Pre-BC.
Well, I know they found ruins that date back to 15,000 years ago in Texas.
Yeah.
But that's not
Right,
Book of Mormon times.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that, yeah, they found some stuff, but it's not the Book of Mormon people, And so I don't know.
Hard to know, right?
I mean, when it's in the millions and you talk about them burying their swords, and the streets that they would have had, I mean, they're talking about giant civilizations, man. They had to have had, they had chariots.
Talk about fortifications and cities.
Yeah, and so
that sort of thing.
I don't know. That's to me where faith is redefined. And so that section's a big one for
Yeah.
me. Things like horses, cattle, oxen, sheep, swine, goats, elephants, wheel, all that stuff just didn't exist before Columbus, and it's in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And so just no archaeologist would be able to stand by the Book of Mormon as a historical record. Right.
So I don't know if I can give you
Okay, that's
assignments,
fine.
But and the anachronisms. I'd say that same thing about verbiage, right? I mean, Joseph only has the words that he has, right? And,
That's true.
and so if they're describing an animal, a South American animal, let's say, and Joseph doesn't have the word for it, what word is he going to use?
Right, and that's where you think where the tapir comes, and it's a tapir instead of a horse and all this kind of stuff, and I could see one or two or three things, but like sheep, swine, goats, elephants, like elephants, like
What's
that's
that? Sure.
What would that be?
Right.
But anyway, so
right, and I do know that some of this stuff is disputed, like the still and the iron, and
of course there are a couple things that are silk and stuff.
Right.
Was it disingenuous for Groh to point Trevor to Sorensen?
No, I don't. It's not disingenuous, because what he was saying is, this isn't my area of specialties. My area of specialties is in history, and specifically this early 19th century history, and it's not in archaeology. So he was just citing again and again, I'm not an archaeologist. We have archaeologists. Go look at them. So,
but if you know that Sorensen's awful,
well, maybe he doesn't know. He's not an archaeologist. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, Glenn.
That's why facts don't matter. Just
Well, it's not disingenuous at all, because he's saying, if you want to believe in the church and you're having trouble with these things, go try this. Go try this. Go try this. I will try to help you keep all of these problems on a shelf if that's really what you want to do. And so I'll suggest going to Sorensen or doing these other things. I think it's unreasonable for us to expect that he, having seen all these things, he comes to the same conclusion that we've come to. And if he doesn't, then there's something wrong with that. I think we have to accept that.
That's fair.
He's perfectly valid in where he's chosen to rest in with his faith and his belief in the church.
I just think that if we all know that Sorensen's, if reasonable, smart people and all the secular archaeologists know that Sorensen's work has no credibility, that should inform the conversation. You should at least give a disclaimer that's like, check out Sorensen, even though every single non-Mormon archaeologist thinks he's crazy, if they look at his work. But check him out. I think it merits that sort of disclaimer in an informed world. That's just my opinion.
Except that what does he want? What does Matthew Groh want for Trevor?
I want him to stay in the church and believe.
Well, he probably wants Trevor to be comfortable with whatever he chooses, But I mean, Matthew Groh seemed like a pretty cool guy, but so I think it's unreasonable to expect him to give that kind of or to have that. I don't see anything from what Matthew Groh says that would indicate that he views Sorensen the way that you just described.
Yeah, but I think I think it's reasonable to say that Sorensen is incredible. I mean, John Hamer, you started with that position that he's sort of a laughingstock amongst informed, archaeologists, Mesoamerican archaeologists like Michael Coe. He's literally a laughingstock, right. And that's not
right.
news.
But I'm just saying that. But
Groh knows that. Groh knows about the Coe interview. Come on.
Okay, I'm just saying what he was saying was he's not an archaeologist. Yeah. He's a historian. It's a different thing.
That's fair. Really quickly about anachronisms, when Gross says Joseph only has the words he has, didn't Joseph use the word curulum and kumamum and all these weird words for coins? Isn't it true that in the Book of Mormon, Joseph comes up with words that he just gets out of nowhere?
I wrote the same note down. So in other words, when he was saying that same thing, well, he doesn't maybe know the words for llama or no, wait, he's like saying elephant, but because he didn't know what a llama was or something like that. And yet, like you say, when there are counter examples in the Book of Mormon where when there's a thing that he doesn't know what it is, you use a word that is presumably from the text, a foreign word, right? So,
and isn't the narrative that Joseph saw the words before he wrote them down? Is that right, Glenn?
That's what I thought too. Yeah, that he asked the question in here, something like, how would Joseph Smith know what to write? Well, he would read the word that God put in front of him.
Exactly.
If that's what, you know.
And he could spell it a phonetic spelling that God would have given him.
But so how can Clark say something like that and not hear how ridiculous it sounds?
Exactly.
Well, but I'm asking it as a real question, not as a rhetorical device to call him stupid. Why is it?
Sorry, Glenn, I keep interrupting you. I don't
know. That's okay.
Get in a room and argue or something.
We argue? Okay.
No. Just for fun. I'll tell you facts don't matter and you can argue. No, so to answer your question, I spent a lot of time with believing Mormon fundamentalists, and this last weekend, especially with faithful FLDS, I got to spend some time with them. And I think that I'm getting really good at paying attention to these dynamics of talking to people who really, really believe and come from a different worldview than I do. And so I was paying attention to this conversation and seeing how Clark engaged versus how Matthew Grow engaged. And it was so interesting to me because they were really having two separate conversations in my opinion. And so Clark, this is a word I've termed for it, is called like the faith force field. Like when you get all of these facts, so Grow and Trevor are having this conversation about all these issues. And I think Clark couldn't hear those issues. Like he was there and he was nodding and he could hear the words, but like the faith force field is up. So it's kind of like bouncing off. So he's hearing, oh, they're having a discussion, but I am so firm in my faith that there are no problems, there are no problems, there are no problems. And so I think when we look at how Clark engaged, it's a completely different conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
When they talk about DNA, does anybody want to just summarize their reaction to the DNA conversation? Basically, they're saying we don't know Lehi's DNA. It could have been swamped by other people. Maybe there were lots of people before the Nephites and the Mulekites. Anybody want to comment on the treatment of DNA just really briefly before we jump on? Is it worth
long
it?
time example of those not appearing in the Book of Mormonites, right? So it's like this asterisk. The majority of the people go entirely unmentioned in the text. So they do mention when they encounter people like the people of Mulek who would just have Hebrew DNA since they're from Judea, right? And so they mention that. They mention when they encounter the last of the Jaredites, but then they have somehow failed to mention the fact that there's this large population of pre-existing indigenous people that have crossed the Bering Strait that are not being mentioned in the text. So that's how modern, in reaction to the fact that the DNA evidence didn't prove out, that's how they've distorted reading the text. So that's the same apologetic stuff that's been around for a long time.
And I just want to point out that Elder Clark was wrong when he talked about the Mulekites having come to the New World from a completely different place.
We know that the Mulekites came from a different place, so
textually they both came from Jerusalem. So he was factually incorrect there, but it didn't have any impact on his testimony, which is more evidence that facts do not matter.
I know, and that's why I was like, cinnamon roll. Like, I just want to hug you and put you over here. Go check on the children in the nursery because this is not a conversation for you. And again, that sounds super condescending, but this is what we're dealing with, right? This is why people are going to the CES letter, because their leadership doesn't even know the facts. Oh, gosh, we need a different word now at this point.
Yeah. I'll just say Jamie Hannes Handy is going crazy about the DNA discussion. She shepherds a really good DNA conversation on Mormon Stories, so please check that out. Shout out to Jamie Hannes Handy. Julie Lester says John Hamer makes me have hope for humanity. Nice job, John Hamer, for giving her some hope. Lots of people giving love for Lindsay. Glenn, I'm sorry, I've not seen one shout out of love for you. Not one. Or me.
That's not what I'm going for.
not going for the love.
No.
That's good. Okay. And I think it's interesting.
I love you, Glenn. I love you.
I love you too, Glenn.
Thanks.
I did think it was interesting that
Hey, John.
John just said that.
Hey, you know what? I've got a new ringtone.
I love you, Glenn. Love you, Glenn. Love you, Glenn. I love you, Glenn.
I think it's interesting that Clark didn't speak up until like the 39-minute mark. So we went 40 minutes into the conversation and Clark stayed silent. And then as soon as he speaks up, as you mentioned, Glenn, maybe he kind of doesn't always know what he's talking about, which is true for me. So I can't fault him either. All right. So we'll go ahead and leave a lot of the truth claim stuff. It quickly moved into a discussion about what prophets are. Trevor basically saying, look, if there's all these errors, if the brethren can't just ask if it's true, what's the point of having prophets? Don't prophets talk to God? And then Grow quickly says, oh, well, what does it mean to be a prophet? I think we should talk about that. And then Clark goes in and talks about the process for blacks in the priesthood and how it was this long process that involves a still small voice, and that it's really a lot, in many cases, it's really a lot like any of our conversations with God, meaning that it's wrought with inaccuracies and can be overturned and can be wrong at any point. But communication happens. Okay, Lindsay, I want to give you first take on this. That whole conversation about prophets and divine communication, that's not talking about faith mattering, the facts mattering. Did you have any reaction to that part of the conversation?
I mean, I feel like this is the trickiest part of Mormonism because I know a lot of prophets now. In the work that I do, I get to meet a lot of prophets. And I mean a lot of prophets. I was just emailing one yesterday. I'm not going to give you his URL, although he'd probably love that. There are a lot of prophets because of this. And I say, well, would your arguments apply to all of those who, prophets that Mormonism has divine revelation and personal revelation, and we have priesthood authority. And because of that, that's a recipe to make prophets, right? So from my perspective, that is how I heard it. Oh, this is so interesting. Would these arguments apply to, maybe the prophet down in Manti, or the prophet down in Parowan, or the prophet up in Canada? That's how I see it. The way that they talked about Monson was really interesting, or the LDS prophet, sort of like, but look how, I think at one point, Clark, I don't know if this is in the conversation, he's like, but look how many temples we have.
The number of temples we have today aren't prophetic.
And I was like, oh man, I feel like we could get a little bit more creative, set our bar a little higher on what we expect of prophets. But those are my thoughts.
I just want to step in really quick. Glenn, we've had several people say that Glenn is amazing. Jennifer, Julie, and Becky all love Glenn. Scott says Glenn is okay. Glenn is okay. Glenn is okay. Glenn is okay. So, Glenn, your stock is rising. Any other reactions to this kind of issue about what prophets are, and sort of it seems like they're defining down what a prophet means. Isn't that what they're doing? They're discounting. Glenn, why don't you talk about that?
Okay. I don't know. I don't really have anything more to say than I think we've already said. To me, once it got into like arguing over like what is prophets, what is, there were several things that he brought up. It just seems like it devolved into arguments where you say, well, this is how I see it. Well, this is how I see it. And there wasn't really any consensus or agreement on how we're going to define things, so why would Trevor say that I have an expectation that a prophet would act
talk to
this
God,
way?
talk to God.
Yeah. Like talk to God directly and get, direction, like clear direction on everything. I think I just don't think that there's any real smoking gun, right or wrong way to take this when it's a faith claim for a religion and a church. And what they're saying is,
sure,
we accept that this church is led by prophets, and the way that it exists right now is completely acceptable to us, as evidenced by the fact that we're still members,
sure,
faithful members of this church.
Sure. The only caveat I'd say is that many of us were taught that prophets literally speak to God, that
Yeah,
communication
so was
is
I.
like the bat phone. And so
was
people
I.
come by that honestly.
Yeah.
And that's why they believe. They actually follow the prophet because they think the prophet's talking to God, not because the prophet gets impressions with feelings and half the time is right and half the time is wrong, just like the rest of us.
Right.
That's just not what that's not what we bought into. That's not what we were sold.
And you have that experience because you were there. You were in that mindset, and now you're not, right?
Yep.
But why would you expect people who are still in that mindset to be anywhere other than in that mindset?
I don't. I think Trevor's making a fair point. You know?
Yeah, I don't think he's not making a fair point.
Yeah.
I think they're both sitting across each other with this huge abyss between them.
For sure.
Why are you attacking everyone, Glenn?
Yeah,
it's just like it's like Lindsay and Trevor. They just can't make a fair point in Glenn's book. I think that actually what the admission here that that Clark has as a member of the first Quorum of the 70 was fairly. This is one of those places, like Trevor was saying, well, he didn't think that this is anything more than they would want to say out loud. I think Matt Groh would like to say most of the things, or has said a lot of these things out loud in the essays. But this part where he says, people imagine in the church where as you go up the hierarchy, that there is, that there's going to be some kind of a difference in process of personal revelation, personal inspiration. And he says that assumption is 100% wrong. Which is to say, so in other words, it's the same exact process up and down, and so that's an admission that should be printed in the Sunday school manuals.
Right.
And that's not. And they even ask themselves, well, can we know how a prophet acts? Can we know? How could we possibly know? Of course we can't know. And I was thinking, of course you can know. You can simply ask the guy. In other words, the guy's right there, and he could write it in the manual. And in fact, that's what in terms of other prophets, Lindsay has been emailing prophets. John DeLynn sat down.
What's the quote from
Steve
Joseph
Beasley.
Smith that's like the first principle of the gospel is knowing the nature of God? There's something like that, of knowing the true nature of God, the characteristics of God. The Mormon God puts obstacles in people's way intentionally. And the Mormon God does not always reveal everything right at once. In the narratives of the Mormon God, he will leave he'll put in a probationary period for Adam and Eve when they can't eat the fruit of the tree, and maybe in his mind, later you'll be able to. He'll put in a probationary period where blacks can't have the priesthood, but at a later time when he's decided, it's okay. That's the Mormon narrative for God. So
right.
if that's the Mormon narrative for God, why are we expecting that God's going to tell us everything that we want to know right in this minute, right now? I think that's an unreasonable position for an ex-Mormon to take if they've been Mormon and they know this is how Mormons think that God is. You can't say, well, why didn't God tell us this? Why didn't he give us a better health code? Why didn't he do these kinds of things? Well, the Mormon God doesn't reveal all of his reasoning for why he does what he does, other than he's bringing about the immortality and eternal life of man, and that includes giving people obstacles and testing how they're going to react to things. So it's completely consistent with the Mormon God that he wouldn't reveal everything right there, that he would intentionally put ambiguity into the system.
But the admission here that I think
how many people like me now, huh?
The admission that I think is important is not, they made that point back to him. They said, you don't expect God to now sit down and answer the CES letter point per point per point or whatever. But the more important admission here is that there is no direct speaking. They said, they kept on going back. No, we'll say it's communication. And they say that it's 100% wrong to think that it's any different from the process that every member of the church is having. And they point to the story, the only overt narrative story that we have for it, which is this sitting around praying about official declaration number 2 and eventually feeling good about it. And that's how revelation comes. So the admission here is no direct talking from God, not an encyclopedia. In other words, we're not getting encyclopedias that are explaining everything. It's none is the answer.
Lindsay.
I'm going to renege on something that I just said, where I said that validation is important, because I was just thinking about this. Validation is important if you want to keep people in the church, right? That if Matthew Groh and Elder Clark wanted to keep him in the church, they should have not argued facts. They should have just validated him. That's my position. However, what I think that we as people who question are probably wrong about is wanting their validation. Because when we're wanting their validation, really what we're wanting is their hierarchical validation. That's what we want. We want them to put their stamp on, like, you found out these facts, you're right about it. That's what we want.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, welcome to the dark side, Lindsay.
Well,
All
that's
right.
what I'm saying. I'm just saying, sorry, my kids were knocking on the door. When we want validation, and that's what Trevor was really saying, like, here are the facts. If we still are looking for the church to tell us, yeah, you're right, those facts aren't true, maybe that's a problem on our end, because they're not going to do it, and maybe we don't need them to. That's all I'm saying.
And that is a fantastic point to end this new part 1 on, because that's just perfect. We really don't need them to validate our choices. I understand why we go for that, but we really, really don't. So anyway, end of part 1. Now, keep in mind that one of the reasons this is being broken up into parts is because Infants on Thrones does this, like, bare bones, as cheap as we can get server to host our stuff on. We're hoping to be able to upgrade our infrastructure. That takes money, and for the last 5 years, basically, we've been putting our own money into this project. It's getting to a point now where we'd like some help and some support. So we're asking you to help support Infants on Thrones. If you want to, donate at our website. It's a PayPal donation. It'll help us improve our infrastructure. All right, and now let's go listen to part 2. Or maybe just take a nap.